Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell you scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse wherever you stream podcasts. Just be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. An important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. It's no secret that I love horror movies more than any other genre. In fact, I just purchased my 400th horror DVD, the Salem's Lot box set recently released by Arrow Video, which, by the way, is my favorite vampire movie of all time. From the first time I watched The Exorcist at 9 years old, I've been hooked on horror. And even today, which, by the way, is my 42nd birthday, I'm constantly chasing the high of being decimated by fear. Without a doubt, the 1980s is my favorite decade for horror. In lots of ways, horror movies were experimental. Writers, directors, studios, and special effects companies were all working together to try to put out something new, unseen, and unique. In some cases, the movies were campy, low budget, and forgettable. But in most cases, the films were iconic, foundational, and even if initially poorly received, gained cult status later. Horror movies in the 1980s walked in the trenches so horror movies today could sprint on stage at the Oscars. One of my favorite horror movies of all time is A Nightmare on Elm Street, the 1984 slasher classic directed by Wes Craven and produced by New Line Cinema. I've no doubt you've seen it once, twice, or maybe 100 times. It introduced the world, both the real one and that of your nightmares, to the terrifying, knife-gloved killer, Freddy Krueger. I rewatched it yesterday, and it still holds up over 40 years later. And here's the thing. There's something you may not know about the original movie. It was inspired by a real-life, horrifying nightmare. I know a ton of horror movies claim to be based on or inspired by true stories. And if you're like me, you either roll your eyes or ignore it altogether. But it's true, at least in part. Because while the real-life story doesn't involve Freddy Krueger and neighborhood teenagers on Elm Street, it does involve the mysterious deaths of Laotian refugees who emigrated to the United States after the Vietnam War, and who died mysteriously in their sleep. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the disturbing case of the Laotian nightmare deaths. What caused the sudden deaths of over 100 Laotian refugees in the 1980s? And were the deaths the result of natural causes, or was something far more sinister at play? I'll tell the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. The story of the Laotian nightmare deaths began at least 2 decades before in the 1960s, halfway across the world in Laos, and amidst the conflict known as the Vietnam War. A beautiful country in Southeast Asia, Laos is home to nearly 8 million people and has a robust history dating back to the 13th century. Landlocked by China and Myanmar to the northwest, Cambodia to the southeast, Thailand to the west and southwest, and Vietnam to the east, Laos is described as quote-unquote a hub for overland trade. Despite steady commerce, Laos is unfortunately considered one of the least developed and poorest countries in Southeast Asia, with nearly 20% of its population living below the poverty line. An important side note: the resiliency of human beings is amazing to behold. Often born out of strife and trauma, people from all over the world and every walk of life carve out beautiful customs and cultures against the greatest and most dangerous odds. Among the ethnic groups living in Laos, the Hmong people are the third largest, with population estimates of up to 600,000. According to the Hmong Association of Washington, quote, "For thousands of years, the Hmong have maintained a distinctive culture, including dress, oral literature, and religion, valuing their autonomy and close-knit community above all." In pre-war Laos, the Hmong remained intact because they lived high in the mountains and had little contact with other people. They farmed in the highlands and harvested enough crops for their own needs. End quote. Over much of the 20th century, the Hmong were divided by various conflicts between opposing groups and parties. In the 1960s, the Vietnam War came to the doorstep of Laos, and specifically the Hmong people, who viewed communism as a threat to their land and way of life. Against this backdrop, the CIA trained 30,000 Hmong, including children, to help fight the war in neighboring Vietnam. Known as the Secret War, U.S.-trained Hmong fighters played a critical role in the conflict. According to the Hmong American Center, quote, "The Hmong played many critical roles under the directions of the U.S. CIA, including harassing the communists on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, providing intelligence about enemy operations, guarding U.S. strategic radar installation, and rescuing downed American pilots." End quote. Their bravery was not without cost, though, as it is estimated, quote, "Hmong soldiers died at a rate 10 times as high as that of American soldiers in Vietnam." Before the war, between 300,000 and 400,000 Hmong lived in Laos. Although there is disagreement over how many died during the war, estimates range from 1/10 to half of the Hmong population was killed. End quote. Equally as tragic, many of the Hmong killed were not soldiers, but rather civilians who perished by mortar fire, mines, grenades, massacres, disease, exposure, and hunger. Despite the heroism and sacrifice of the Hmong, in 1975, Laos fell to communist forces, and with it, a new terrifying reality began. Almost immediately, American relief programs stopped, and the Laos People Party, quote, "declared the Hmong enemies of the state," end quote. Several thousand high-ranking Hmong military officers and their families were airlifted to nearby Thailand, while thousands of soldiers and their families were left behind. In the decade between 1975 and 1985, it is estimated nearly 100,000 Hmong died while trying to flee Laos, with an estimated 50,000 lost while trying to cross the Mekong River. Over 100,000 were sponsored to enter the United States. In July 1980, a man named Yang Leng Tao relocated from Laos to Portland, Oregon with his wife, Zhang Yu, and 8 children. A few months later, on January 8, 1981, Tao stayed up late to watch television. But sometime after midnight, he turned the television off and climbed in bed next to his wife. Within a few minutes, he was sound asleep. But sometime soon after, Zhang was awakened by the sound of her husband struggling to breathe. Panicked, she rolled him over to wake him up. To her horror, he was dead. Dr. Larry V. Newman conducted the autopsy and was stunned when he realized this was the second instance of sudden death in less than a week. Just 3 days before, Zhang To Zhang, a 29-year-old Hmong man, died suddenly in his sleep with no explanation. And despite post-mortem tests, Dr. Lumen could not determine a cause of death. Within a short time, the mystery deepened as he discovered 2 additional deaths in the previous 9 months, stating, quote, "All were very, very similar. They were restricted to males, all relatively young who died during their sleep." End quote. Determined to figure out what was happening, Dr. Lumen reached out to officials in areas with higher numbers of Hmong and Southeast Asian refugees. Nearly 2,000 miles away, in St. Paul, Minnesota, Dr. Lumen learned there were 4 similar unexplained deaths. But that's not all. There were open cases in Seattle, Washington, Orange County, California, and Des Moines, Iowa. In February 1981, another case was reported in Minneapolis, Minnesota, bringing the number of unexplained deaths to 13 since 1977. An article in the LA Times entitled "Mysterious Fatal Malady Striking Hmong Men" and dated July 14, 1981, stated, quote, "The attacks were all unexpected, fatal, and utterly mysterious. The 20 victims, all but one of them young, apparently healthy men, were stricken in the middle of the night, and they died in agony. Autopsies by some of the best pathologists in the country have been unable to explain the cause of the seizures. What is even more vexing is that all of the victims are members of the Hmong tribes, Southeast Asian refugees dispossessed of their Laotian mountain homeland because they backed the United States in an ill-fated war." End quote. The first known mysterious death was that of Lee Dua in 1977, a healthy young man who died in his sleep. The LA Times article stated, quote, "There was an autopsy which put down the cause of death as acute cardiac insufficiency. That is a fancy way of saying they didn't know exactly what killed him." End quote. That's part of what makes this story so scary. Seemingly healthy men dying suddenly while doing something natural and normal. I suspect most of us don't give a second thought to going to bed at night. And I can't recall an instance where I thought I might die in my sleep without explanation. An article written by R.G. Munger in 1987 stated, quote, "A striking pattern of sudden and unexpected death during sleep occurs among Southeast Asian refugees in the United States. The victims are predominantly young men, all in apparent good health, who die within minutes of the onset of agonal respirations during sleep. The proximate cause of death appears to be ventricular fibrillation in the absence of known cardiovascular disease." End quote. In one stunning case, a Hmong man living in Seattle lived through his ordeal. One article stated, quote, "The victim, a member of the Hmong community in Seattle, has become in effect a living laboratory for the study of the malady. When he arrived at the hospital, he was found to be in ventricular fibrillation. The heart muscle was contracting without affecting normal beats, just sort of quivering." End quote. According to the Cleveland Clinic, ventricular fibrillation is, quote, "an abnormal heart rhythm that makes your lower heart chambers move quickly and randomly. This life-threatening condition affects your lower heart chamber's ability to pump blood." End quote. Symptoms of ventricular fibrillation include chest pain, dizziness, nausea, erratic pulse, heart palpitations, and shortness of breath. A person experiencing ventricular fibrillation, quote, "will collapse with little to no warning and won't respond or react when you try to wake them. They'll also gasp for breath or stop breathing." End quote. The patient received immediate medical treatment and survived. And over the course of several weeks, he, quote, "developed the typical electrocardiogram pattern of a person who had suffered a heart attack." End quote. For some, this explanation was sufficient. But for others, it brought more questions than answers. How can healthy young men suddenly die in their sleep without cause or explanation? What happened was obvious, but why it happened was not. And as you can imagine, a variety of theories came to the forefront. We'll explore these right after this quick ad break.
Sometimes, the monsters we should really be afraid of aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones that have been standing in front of us this entire time. My name is Rissa Montañez, and I'm the founder of Grave Moon Studios. Every monster has a story. We get to tell it. Coming soon to wherever you listen to podcasts.
There are some who believe the men died due to exposure to chemical agents during the Vietnam War, the most infamous being Agent Orange. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, Agent Orange, quote, was a tactical herbicide used by the U.S. military for control of vegetation, end quote. For over a decade, up until production and use was halted in 1971, the U.S. military sprayed massive amounts of Agent Orange throughout Vietnam. The goal was to, quote, defoliate trees and shrubs and kill food crops that were providing cover and food to opposition forces, end quote. Agent Orange contained a dangerous chemical called dioxin, which can cause cancer, reproductive and developmental problems, and damage to the immune system. Despite this, medical professionals quickly ruled this out as a possibility, citing the victims were only males who died suddenly in their sleep. From a medical standpoint, the ailment was given a name: Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome, or SUNS. A 2018 article in the Journal of the American Heart Association stated, quote, since the first report of 12 sudden, unexplained nocturnal deaths among Laotian refugees in the United States was submitted, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had received 13 reports with a total number of 117 SUNS cases in Southeast Asian refugees during 1981 to 1988. The mean age was 33 years old, and 75% were 25 to 44 years old. Gurgling, gasping, or labored respirations appeared in some victims before death. None of the victims had a history of syncope episodes, epilepsy, or allergies. Only one of 51 SUNS cases was confirmed to have family history, end quote. Here's the thing. As the name suggests, sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome occurs without notice and has no clear cause, though some medical professionals believe stress could be a factor. A New York Times article entitled, Nightmare Suspected in Bed Deaths of 18 Laotians, and dated May 10, 1981, stated, quote, the deaths have generally been attributed to probable cardiac arrhythmia, or irregular heartbeat. Although pathologists have been reluctant to advance it publicly, one possibility being explored is an obscure pattern described in medical literature as Oriental Nightmare Death Syndrome, in which death results from terror induced by a nightmare, end quote. Something interesting. Though this may sound far-fetched, there are more than a few who believe this to be the case. Traditional Hmong beliefs include a sleep paralysis demon they call Da Cho, who attacks sleepers by, quote, sitting on their chests, sometimes attempting to strangle them, end quote. Consider for a moment the trauma and stress Hmong refugees experienced after the Vietnam War. Forced relocation to a new country, the expected assimilation into a brand new culture, and the loss of traditional spiritual ceremonies or proper ancestor rituals for protection. Dr. Shelley Adler believes, quote, the power of traditional belief in Da Cho, compounded by such factors as the trauma of war, migration, rapid acculturation, and the inability to practice traditional healing and ritual, can cause cataclysmic psychological stress, end quote. An important distinction, Dr. Adler uses the word nightmare, quote, not in the modern sense of a bad dream, but rather in older traditional terms as the nocturnal visit of an evil being that threatens to press the very life out of its terrified victim, end quote. her research raises an important question. Is it possible the Hmong victims died at the hands of Da Cho? And is it possible Da Cho visited them because the Hmong were no longer able to care for their loved ones, who'd passed on before them? Dr. Adler stated, quote, "Of the Hmong families who continued in ancestor worship, every one of them expressed the view that they were not able to satisfactorily perform certain religious ceremonies. Reasons for this were that, besides being fearful of the police and breaking public health laws, many complained that since they were not allowed to raise or slaughter animals in their homes, it was difficult to find adequate livestock necessary for Hmong ceremonies. Some families said that due to the disruption of village and clan groups caused by relocation, they were unable to find a Hmong religious leader or other family members to help in the performance of correct ceremonies. Others cited that living in an apartment was not conducive to providing a central pillar for ancestors to live in." End quote. This is an important point. From the outside looking in, relocation to the United States represented a chance at life. But for the Hmong themselves, that second chance came with a loss of cultural and religious identity, key parts of who they were individually and collectively. Coupled with a lack of access to culturally appropriate resources, the Hmong were thrust into a world they neither recognized nor understood. And over 100 died in a sudden and terrifying way. To this day, there is no explanation for the deaths. I've known about the Laotian nightmare deaths for a few years now, and no matter how many times I revisit it, I'm always saddened. The story ultimately is one of loss and grief. First, the Hmong people were forced out of their homeland, a place of safety and comfort and familiarity, to a new home halfway across the world in an unfamiliar country. In some ways, they lost their home, culture, religion, language, customs, food, and safety. And then, while doing their best to adjust and acclimate to their new surroundings, many of them died suddenly and inexplicably. It feels like tragedy upon tragedy. It's also easy to see how Wes Craven drew inspiration for A Nightmare on Elm Street. In many ways, there is nothing more human than taking a nap or getting a good night's sleep. So it makes good sense that one of the scariest horror movie villains attacked when you were the most vulnerable. Both the mysterious Hmong deaths and Freddy Krueger are the stuff of literal nightmares. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. What caused the sudden deaths of over 100 Laotian refugees in the 1980s? And were the deaths the result of natural causes, or was something far more sinister at play? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.